Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a single, very specific source material. It's a transcription of a conversation from a YouTube video featuring Colonel Douglas McGregor.
That's right. And our mission here really is to take this one conversation and just, pull out the core claims, the key perspectives, some of the arguments presented within it.
Which cover quite a range.
Oh, yeah. We'll be touching on the conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East, the U.S. financial situation, even the future of Europe. The goal is just to give you a quick, clear handle on the viewpoint from this specific source.
Exactly. Think of it as getting the concentrated essence of this one take on some huge global issues, pulled right from the material and the perspective offered. Well, it sets a pretty striking tone right away.
It certainly does. I mean, the source puts forth the very blunt claim that everything you hear in the West is bullshit. And it pairs that with a pretty stark warning that the United States is on the verge of a financial collapse. So that gives you a sense of the viewpoint we're exploring. And the main voice here is Colonel Douglas McGregor.
Okay, so we're diving into his views from this particular discussion. Let's jump right into the Ukraine conflict. That's a major focus here. According to this source, what's the perspective on Donald Trump's position regarding Ukraine?
Well, the assertion made is that despite the U.S. funding Ukraine, sending weapons, Trump himself is seen as not in charge of anything.
Not in charge.
Yeah. His public comments on it are described in the source as incoherent and absurd, even diametrically opposed to things he apparently said not long before.
So the idea is his words and the actual policy don't line up, suggesting he's not driving the decisions.
Precisely. This perspective presents a strong claim that U.S. foreign and defense policy isn't actually run by the president.
But by who then?
By the CIA, it says, and other powerful sort of behind-the-scenes figures. The source states quite emphatically that Trump has no influence whatsoever here. And it suggests European leaders are kind of on autopilot, too, responding to the same pressures.
Okay, that's a very specific picture of how this source thinks things work at the top. How does this view suggest Russia is interpreting all this?
The perspective offered is that Russia, looking from Moscow, has basically concluded Trump isn't in control.
Right.
And because of that, they believe they have to end the war on their own terms, using their own means. The source says Russia's main principle has always been to avoid war with the U.S. and NATO.
But they're seeing escalation from Europe.
But they are also watching European leaders adopt very strident anti-Russian positions.
Yes.
What kind of positions does it point to specifically?
The source mentions figures like Merz in Germany, Macron in France, Starmer in the UK. It highlights announcements about possibly lifting restrictions on using long-range missiles, citing the German Taurus missile.
The one with the long range. Yeah, 500 kilometers. It could, as the source puts it, conceivably hit Moscow.
So, from Russia's perspective, according to this source, they see European escalation and maybe inconsistent U.S. leadership.
That's the argument presented, yes. And based on that, the source claims Russia expects to escalate and ultimately win this war on their own terms, pretty much ignoring U.S. statements because, well, they believe Trump isn't really in charge anyway.
Now, the source makes some very controversial claims about actions on the ground, particularly about civilian targets.
It presents a view that's, sharply different from many Western reports. This source asserts the idea that the Russian military is like the old Soviet military is utterly false.
How so?
It claims Russians are not hitting civilian targets unless the Ukrainian military has occupied them, using places like hospitals, the source says, to set up anti-tank missiles, for instance.
And in those cases?
In those specific cases, the source argues, the Russians feel they have to destroy the weapon system, which might mean hitting the building itself.
And it flips the script, claiming the other side targets civilians.
Yes, the source claims it's Ukrainians attacking hospitals and civilian targets. Gives an example. An alleged Ukrainian drone attack on Putin's helicopter near Kursk, asserting this was undoubtedly with help from the CIA.
The conversation also brings up this idea of a powerful group pushing for the war to continue.
Absolutely. It talks about a powerful, perpetual war lobby.
Where does it say this lobby exists?
It claims this lobby dominates inside the Beltway, on the Hill in the Central Intelligence Agency, and to a large extent at the Department of Defense.
And it draws a line between different groups.
Yeah, it makes a distinction between people in the military who have, real skin in the game, and those on the Hill who, in this source's view, have no skin in the game and could care less about the actual human cost.
What about U.S. military aid to Ukraine, especially thinking about a potential Trump presidency again? What does the source say there?
Well, it notes Trump's aid might have been less than Biden's, but it expects aid to ramp up regardless. It also contains the claim that U.S. weapon stocks are clearly quite low, but insists wasteful cash is still flowing to Ukraine.
Okay, one of the most striking points in this source, and definitely debated, is about casualty figures. The numbers are way off from many public reports.
They are dramatically different, yeah. This source gives significantly higher figures for Ukrainian military casualties. It claims over 1.5 million soldiers killed.
1.5 million.
That's the number given, compared to estimated Russian losses, which it puts around 120,000 to 130,000 dead troops. And that includes forces from Chechnya, Luhansk, Donetsk.
So a huge difference in the ratio.
It asserts the casualty ratio has worsened for Ukraine, claiming it's gone from 1 to 6 to above 1 to 10, and it attributes these supposed high Ukrainian losses to the army just falling apart.
Where does the source claim it's getting these numbers? That's crucial.
It's very specific on this. It claims its primary info comes from Russian, Polish, and Ukrainian people on the ground talking directly to the speaker.
And it dismisses other reports.
Explicitly dismisses Western reports on casualties as bullshit and just lies. It really emphasizes needing to talk to people with direct, on-the-ground contact to get what it calls the truth.
And based on this picture of the conflict, the casualties, what's the source's overall assessment of Ukraine's situation?
The claim made is very stark. It says, Ukraine is finished as a state.
Finish. Wow. Okay. The source also goes into the nature of the Ukrainian regime itself, using some very strong language,
It does. It describes the current government as a neo-Nazi regime.
even addressing Zelensky's background.
Yes, the source discusses the fact that Zelensky is Jewish, as are apparently many in his circle, and predecessors like Poroshenko. He even claims Yeltsin was Jewish. It suggests Zelensky was selected by many of the same people that have selected leaders in Western Europe, specifically to lead this campaign against Russia.
And it connects this to symbols, how?
Yes, it highlights the use of what it calls ridiculous Nazi symbols. It links this back to historical choices Eastern Europeans faced in World War II.
Yeah.
Fight with the Soviets or join the Wehrmacht or Waffen-SS.
Right.
The source claims millions joined the German side back then. It suggests these symbols are seen as useful today for mobilizing Ukrainians against a perceived Russian threat, but calls them fundamentally depraved and says they should have been discarded.
And the argument is Russia finds this unacceptable.
Exactly. The source argues that a government tolerating or promoting these symbols on its border is unacceptable to Russia.
What about inside Ukraine, popular support, resistance? What does the conversation say?
The source claims Zelensky is about as popular as AIDS inside Ukraine. Pretty blunt language.
Very.
And it also suggests that for the first time, there's real evidence of huge numbers of young men organizing themselves inside Ukraine to resist any further compulsory military service.
So this picture of potential instability, that leads to discussions about migration, right, if the front lines shift.
Yes. The source raises the risk of large numbers of people moving west into Europe if the front collapses and the Russians advance, maybe towards the Dnieper River.
And this is seen negatively.
Yeah, the source claims people in Poland, Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, Germany really want these Ukrainians to go home. It suggests the Russians don't actually want to rule Ukrainians and might even sort of help them cross the Dnieper to leave.
And the solution offered for European countries.
Simple, according to this source, defend your borders.
Okay, let's shift gears now. The conversation also gives an outlook on the Middle East conflict. What claims does it make about Israeli goals?
The source states that the Israelis are committed to project Greater Israel.
And what does that entail, according to this view?
It's said to involve the elimination of the Arab population or the Palestinian population in both Gaza and the West Bank. Doesn't matter if they're Muslim or Christian, it says, and also aims to subjugate their neighbors.
And there's a particularly striking claim about Prime Minister Netanyahu's influence in Washington.
There is. The source claims Netanyahu enjoys far, far more influence on Capitol Hill than Donald Trump does.
More than Trump.
That's the claim. It goes further, alleging that large sums of money were spent to put him, Trump, in office by the supporters of the Israel lobby inside the United States.
And how does the source describe Trump's reaction, or maybe lack of reaction, to this?
It suggests Trump just avoids contradicting the Israelis. When Gaza comes up, he's said to either talk about its real estate value or just change the subject. Basically, unwilling to push back when pressed by Israeli interests.
Even if he personally dislikes Netanyahu.
Right. The source makes the point that while everyone who deals with Netanyahu apparently dislikes him, maybe including Trump, the argument is Netanyahu is still in charge on these matters, not Donald.
So what does the source see as the likely path forward in the Middle East then?
The probable outcome, according to this source, is that the Israelis will find a way to start the war with Iran. Could be a direct attack, it suggests, or maybe what it calls a false flag operation.
Yeah.
And the reason given is that Netanyahu, according to the source, is not succeeding in Gaza and needs to expand the conflict, like into a war with Iran, basically to stay in power.
And the U.S. role in that scenario, according to this view?
The assertion is, because of the support Netanyahu supposedly has in the Senate and House, the U.S. would be compelled to join that war against Iran.
What about international pressure, countries stopping arms sales, things like that? Does that matter?
The source claims Netanyahu doesn't care at all about that stuff as long as he has U.S. backing and unfettered access to our munitions and our weapon systems.
So is there anything this source thinks could stop this potential slide towards war with Iran?
It suggests the only real check on Israel at this point would be Iran striking back hard.
Really?
Yeah, this, it's claimed, would have an enormous impact and could potentially risk other regional players, Egyptians, Jordanians, Turks, maybe turning around and attacking him, Netanyahu.
Why haven't they acted yet then?
The argument presented is that these other countries fear going to war with the United States, not necessarily just the Israeli military itself.
Okay. Moving to another major area in this conversation, the U.S. financial situation. The picture painted here is pretty grim.
It's presented as being right on the verge of a financial collapse. That's the core warning.
And what's the key indicator? The thing to watch, according to the source.
A bond market. Specifically, the 10-year bond. That's called the bellwether.
And why is that?
The source claims interest rates keep rising despite the Fed trying to control them, which means the Fed has lost control.
And there's a specific trigger point mentioned, a number.
Yes, according to this source. When the 10-year bond yield hits 5%, meaning the bond prices themselves are falling, the U.S. can't service the debt. And the claim is, at that point, everything collapses.
Is there any sense in this source that this debt problem is, fixable easily?
None at all. The source states flat out the U.S. debt is not sustainable, and that no one, that lists hypotheticals like Einstein or Santa Claus or even Trump, can fix it without taking really drastic measures.
What kind of measures does it argue are needed but aren't happening?
It calls for massive spending cuts and suggests probably even default might be necessary.
Default?
Yeah. And the view presented is that Trump is unwilling to take the stringent measures needed, like, say, cutting the defense budget by 50%, or tackling entitlements like Social Security, which the source just says is bankrupt. Instead, the argument is he's doubled down on failed policies.
The source brings in some history here, too, regarding U.S. defaults.
It does. It mentions FDR's administration effectively defaulting twice in 1934 and 36, framed as restructuring back then.
And why was that possible then, but maybe not now?
The source notes that back then, the U.S. had the world's largest manufacturing base, a big skilled labor force. So creditors felt confident the U.S. could recover.
And the problem today, according to this source?
It claims the U.S. doesn't have the largest manufacturing base anymore, says that's China now, argues the skilled workforce has shrunk because of offshoring, a struggling education system. And on top of that, the source states the U.S. is spending a lot subsidizing 50+ million illegals.
Any other historical examples mention financial shifts?
Yeah, Richard Nixon taking the U.S. off the gold standard, which the source notes was supposed to be temporary at the time.
So, given this really negative financial outlook, does the source offer any potential path forward or predict what kind of change might happen?
Well, Bitcoin is mentioned briefly as offering a path forward. More broadly, though, it predicts a fundamental change in the United States, in how business is done, how the country is organized, suggesting it could lead to a big geopolitical shift, maybe a Western Hemisphere bloc separate from Eurasia and Europe.
That actually leads us nicely into the discussion on Europe, another area where the source offers some pretty strong critiques and predictions.
Right. The source highlights what it sees as a major disconnect in Europe. A lack of popular support for war with Russia, but European governments acting like war is exactly what they want. This whole situation is described as catastrophic.
So what does the source suggest Europeans should do about that?
The view presented is that Europeans need to take control of their own destiny and basically get rid of these governments.
Why?
Because, according to the source, the United States won't help them. and specifically that Trump won't do anything for them.
And there's a direct warning about Russian retaliation if Europe keeps pushing.
Absolutely. The source warns that if European leaders, it specifically mentions Matz in Germany, are serious about helping Ukrainians launch missiles into Russia, then Germany should be prepared for Russian missiles to land on German soil.
Wow.
It points to the Russian Kinzhal missile, claiming it can hit every potential military target in Europe with conventional warheads. The perspective offered is that Putin's been patient, but expects Europeans to wake up to this possibility.
The source also reframes the Ukraine conflict itself from a Russian viewpoint, it seems.
Yes, it characterizes the conflict as a defensive war waged by the Russians in eastern Ukraine.
Defensive, how?
It's presented as a reaction against what the source calls that neo-Nazi regime that we helped to set up in 2014, which it claims killed about 14,000 people in Donetsk and Luhansk after 2014. The source explicitly says this is not a war of conquest led by Stalin, but that the Russians finally have had enough.
The conversation also challenges alliances, right? Especially NATO.
It really questions what it means to be allied with the U.S. today in a world that it says has changed.
How has it changed in this view?
Well, it claims a huge operation like the Normandy landing is just impossible now because of modern precision strike weapons. It echoes that sentiment often attributed to Trump, arguing Europeans have to become their own first responders, handle their own defense.
And there's a controversial take on who Europe has been focusing on fighting.
Yeah, the source argues Europeans need to realize they've been fighting the wrong people for the wrong reasons, and it points directly at the Russians.
Saying Russia isn't a threat.
It claims Russians are not an existential threat to Europe, that they mainly want to do business. It even brings up a historical symbiotic relationship between Germans and Russians, only really broken by the world wars.
Yeah.
Germany's current economic problems are called suicidal deindustrialization, which the source says is self-inflicted.
This wider view of Europe, it leads the source to speculate about the continent maybe breaking up or realigning.
Yes, the idea comes up that Europe might fracture into more homogeneously smaller blocks, driven by different national interests. It even references the old Roman line as a kind of historical, cultural, or military dividing line that might still have some relevance.
Does it get specific about potential new groups or relationships?
It does, yeah. It suggests Britain will likely stick close to the U.S. and Canada. Maybe Iceland and Norway, too, might prefer that relationship over continental Europe.
And within the continent.
It proposes a possible Nordic or Central East European security zone, including Germans, Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Finns, Swedes, Danes, Dutch, and Flemish, describing these as peoples who will get along together.
It uses Belgium as an example of complexity.
Yes, to illustrate the ambiguity of European history. Noting the long-standing Flemish complaints about subsidizing Wallonia, it also sees Austria and Hungary thinking along similar strategic lines, despite their history.
And finally, there's a critique of the euro currency itself in the conversation.
A very harsh one. The source calls adopting the euro the dumbest thing, and claims it had no chance of success right from the beginning.
Why not?
Because of the radically different monetary and financial policies between countries like, say, Germany and the Netherlands versus Italy and France. Just fundamentally incompatible, according to this view.
Wow. Okay. That is an enormous amount of ground covered in just one conversation. I mean, we've pulled out claims on military conflicts, influence of different groups, stark economic warnings, European history, potential future realignments.
It really shows the breadth of topics a single source like this can weave together. And, even if you don't agree with every point, looking at material like this gives you a very clear map of a specific viewpoint and how the arguments connect. It's a way to understand these alternative perspectives, the claims being made, even the controversial ones.
Exactly. It's about getting a quick grasp of the ideas being put out there in the material you're examining. As we wrap up this deep dive, it feels right to circle back to a really provocative thought the source leaves us with right at the very end.
Yes, that concluding idea presented is that the wars we should really be concerned about, well, they aren't overseas. They're not beyond our borders.
They are the wars inside our borders.
That's the phrase used.
That's right.
And the source makes the claim that national survival will entirely depend on the outcome of the war we fight at home, not overseas.
It's a significant and maybe challenging point to end on, isn't it? Makes you think. What exactly are those wars inside our borders in your own context?
Definitely something to ponder.
A lot to think about indeed. That wraps up this deep dive into the conversation from this specific source. Thanks for joining us.